Ancient China has its share of colorful characters. Good ones, bad ones, everything in between. But imagine a prince of ancient China who rides out at night with his band of ruffians, torches in hand, hunting human prey across the moonlit fields. And by dawn, the result is dozens lying dead, slain for no reason other than his cruel amusement. It's not the plot of a horror film. It's real history. This story comes from the Han Dynasty, and it's the case of Prince Liu Pengli, who the grand historian Sima Qian tells us murdered over 100 of his subjects, simply for sheer sport. Of course, when we think of serial killers, we often have modern images in our heads like, I don't know, Jeffrey Dahmer or even Jack the Ripper. Yet, as we go all the way back into those ancient records of China, we discover that the phenomenon of individuals who kill repeatedly is certainly not something new. Imperial chronicles and legends preserved accounts of men, and yes, occasionally even women, who repeated acts of murder and left their own gruesome mark on history. So today, as in keeping with our series in ancient serial killers, and we've done a few medieval ones too, we are looking at ancient China, where once again the story is darker than you think. But let me welcome you to the channel first. Hello to any newcomers, and welcome to anyone coming back. If you've not yet clicked the subscribe button, I encourage you to do so. You'll get plenty more like this, and I hope you're enjoying the current playlist. Now, speaking of which, all of the videos on here, all the playlists and everything, they're all ad-free, so you can enjoy it from start to finish without any interruptions, whether you're falling asleep or you just want to busy yourself with some other task and have something in the background. Now, this is made possible due to the generous support that we get on Patreon, YouTube memberships, the merch store, and also the occasional donation on PayPal and the Super Thanks. So thank you very much for all that, and if you're interested in any of those links, well, you can find them in the pinned comment, video, and channel description. And of course, tell your friends, like, comment, that sort of thing. That always helps us in the algorithm. Now, with all that being said and out of the way, let us begin our video for our time together today. Back to ancient China this time. Chinese tradition holds that the very first dynasties ended under the rule of monstrous tyrants, men whose excesses and brutality became a kind of archetype of evil in later ages, a cautionary tale, almost like a nightmare of a time long past. But while these ancient accounts are part legend, i.e. the Xia dynasty, traditionally 2070 to 1600 BC, it is semi-mythical, they were treated as history by ancient writers and are worth examining as the earliest serial killers in Chinese cultural memory. Now, chief among them is King Jie of Xia and King Zhou of Xiang, two names that became bywords for cruelty. Well, let's start with King Jie of the Xia dynasty. He is remembered as a violent and capricious ruler, whose indulgence in bloodthirst and debauchery practically knew no bounds. According to later accounts, Jie was, quote, violent, picky, temperamental, and capricious. Certainly not a very good rap sheet, that's for sure. He apparently cared only for pleasure, encouraged by his favorite concubine, Mo Xi, and tormented his officials and people. One infamous tale claims that Jie built a lake of alcohol, and not mere wine either, none of that watered-down 10% stuff. We're talking potent liquor, and he forced all of his courtiers to drink from it. The pool was so vast that one could actually boat across it, and those who tried to consume its contents could only end up drowning, or if they were good at swimming, the alcohol poisoning would get them. Jie and Mo Xi allegedly hosted orgies around this alcohol lake, and Mo Xi herself enjoyed watching people suffer. It is said that she laughed at the sight of men dying of intoxication. Well, in another equally outrageous story, King Jie would make high ministers crawl on all fours like horses so he could ride on their backs for his amusement. Those who refused, or just didn't do a very good job of it, faced creative executions. His whims were law, and often lethal, a truly terrifying tyrant, if these stories are to be believed. In any case, by the end of Jie's reign, traditionally 17th century BCE, the Xia kingdom was in chaos. The bamboo annals and other ancient records describe how Jie's oppressive rule alienated the people, leading the virtuous Tang of Shang to rise in rebellion. When Tang overthrew Jie, he pointed to Jie's atrocities to justify the rebellious action, claiming that heaven itself condemned the tyrant. Thus, in Chinese memory, Jie's repeated cruelties, essentially a series of murderous abuses of power, directly caused the fall of China's first dynasty. Well, following the Shah, you had the Shang dynasty, that is 1600 to 1046, and it eventually produced its own legendary villain, King Zhou, also known as Di Xin, the last Shang monarch. King Zhou's story is a little bit better documented, or at least more extensively told in the classical texts. Sima Qian's Records of the Grand Historian, written in the Han Dynasty, paints Zhou as, quote, one of the most wicked tyrants in history. And you don't get a name like that from just taxing people a little bit too much. He is depicted as initially a capable warrior king, but later he gave himself over to debauchery, violence, and superstition. The chronicles describe Zhou's palace at Yin turning into a nightmarish playground of cruelty. Like Jie, King Zhou is said to have created a wine pool and a meat forest as a symbol of outrageous luxury and, well, frankly, degeneracy. Sima Qian records that Zhou, quote, filled a pond with alcohol and hung meat from trees like a forest, causing men and women to frolic naked among them in an endless night of revelry. A grotesque spectacle, that's for sure. Literally boating in liquor and grabbing roasted meat off the bowels. It's been immortalized by the Chinese idiom jiu chi rou lin, wine pool, meat forest. It basically means extreme indulgence in sensual pleasures when someone goes off the rails, almost to the point of no return. While certainly hyperbolic, the story conveys a sense of a ruler whose appetites were unchecked and whose court became a den of vice. Worse still, King Zhou's pleasures were not only decadent but quite sadistic. To please his favorite consort, Da Ji, often later portrayed as a malevolent fox spirit in disguise, Zhou devised cruel new methods of torture. One infamous invention was the Pao Lao, sometimes called the cannon-burning punishment. According to legend, Zhou had a large, hollow bronze cylinder smeared with oil and heated red-hot with charcoal. Prisoners were forced to hug the glowing metal pillar, resulting in agonizing burns and flesh literally cooked. Sima Qian noted that Zhou, quote, made a bronze pillar red-hot and made the victim walk on it. Another variant of this torture. Well, even more disturbingly, Believe it or not, King Zhou and Daji were said to have become sexually aroused while watching these horrifying executions. They would reportedly delight in the screams of victims. Later stories claimed that Daji had a particular love of cruel tricks. For instance, she supposedly ordered a pregnant woman's belly cut open out of curiosity to see the fetus, and smiled at the sight. Well, whether or not such specific incidents occurred, it's a pretty clear image. The king as a perverse serial killer. One who kills repeatedly, not out of necessity or even anger, but just entertainment, and strangely, perverted lust. The fall of the Shang, of course, is directly linked to Zhou's atrocities in traditional accounts, and by the end, Zhou's violence extended even to his own loyalists. In a particularly gruesome episode recorded by Sima Qian, Zhou's uncle and prime minister, the sage Prince Bi Gan, dared to remonstrate with him about his misrule. And he didn't like that. He was enraged, and perhaps influenced by Daji's whispered insinuations. King Zhou had Bi Gan's heart cut out of his chest. To test a bit of a dark joke, legend held that hearts of truly wise men have 7 openings, and Zhou wanted to see if the proverb was actually true. The loyal minister was executed in this barbaric fashion. His crime, simply telling the king an unpleasant truth. Now, this is why later in medieval times they had jesters around. It was kind of the jester's job to keep the rulers somewhat human, and also to tell jokes, parables, those sorts of stories with little hints in them, without having direct challenges to authority or anything like that. Plausible deniability. Well, another minister, Prince Weizi, wisely feigned madness to escape a similar fate. Zhou's rampage of murders, from high-ranking nobles to common prisoners, destroyed any remaining support for his reign. Eventually, the neighboring Zhou clan, not to be confused, by the way, with King Zhou himself, led by King Wu of Zhou, launched an uprising. In the climactic Battle of Muye, that is 1046, King Zhou of Shang was defeated. Facing capture, he took his own life in his burning palace. And thus ended the Shang dynasty, with its last king remembered as the epitome of depraved murder, a crescendo to all of the suffering. Chinese histories later gave him the posthumous name Zhou, becoming a permanent label for villainy. Well, it is important to note that these early accounts blend history with a bit of moralistic storytelling. Ancient Chinese historians believe strongly in the concept of the mandate of heaven. If you don't know what that is, it's essentially the idea that heaven would bless a just ruler and withdraw support from an evil one. Well, you basically knew that the ruler was evil if you started having floods and fires and all sorts of natural disasters, especially earthquakes. You would be thinking, well, heaven has removed the mandate. But if things are going well, harvests are good, everything's peaceful, well, heaven is pleased with the leader, and thus doesn't shake things up. Now, as a result, the bad last emperor narrative became a very much recurring pattern. Dynasties were said to end in a crescendo of corruption and bloodshed, and that justifies the rise of a new order. Modern scholars have certainly cast doubt on a few of the most lurid details. For example, the practicality of the wine pool and meat forests has been somewhat questioned, of course. How could a lake of wine be maintained? How could meat be hung without spoiling out in the open like that? I don't know. It doesn't really hold up under scrutiny. But still, we see these same kind of patterns in Greek history as well. The earlier stories, yes, they might be a little bit embellished, but they certainly come from somewhere. And it's likely in the case of ancient China that writers of the Zhou and Han periods embellished the crimes of Jie and Zhou to serve as these kind of cautionary examples. But nevertheless, even if they are exaggerated, they reflect an underlying reality recognized by those writers, and that is extreme cruelty by those in power, repeated over time, will invite disaster. Sima Qian, though writing long after the Shang, presented King Zhou's sadism in detail, and clearly believed it to be illustrative of why the Shang fell, and he frankly lists Zhou's various evils: indulgence in wine, women, lavish taxes to fund his whims, and of course the innovative tortures. But later Confucian scholars like Mencius, this is the Greek rendering by the way, frequently invoked Jie and Zhou in the same breath as bywords for immoral leadership and human depravity. So in effect these early tyrants were depicted as serial killers on thrones, personal vices writ large as national catastrophe. So between the fall of the Shang dynasty, that's 1046 BC, and the rise of the unified Qin Empire, 221 BC, China went through the pretty long Zhou dynasty period, and that includes eras such as the Spring and Autumn from 770 to 476 and the Warring States era, 475 to 221, and it was a time of frequent wars, political assassinations, and of course, general social upheaval. Historical records from these centuries, like the Zhuozhuan chronicles and various state annals, certainly recount quite a few killings. However, most violence in this period was political or military in nature. We read of massacres of rival clans, ambushes of enemy troops, and scheming ministers poisoning or strangling their lords. These were often one-time events or campaigns, not a single individual killing repeatedly for personal gratification. The concept of a serial killer in the modern sense is harder to spot amid the organized chaos of the era, but there's a few figures that stand out for their cruelty and frequency of murder, so we can talk about them. One notorious practice of the time was the extermination of rival families or factions. In several spring and autumn states, when a minister fell from favor or a coup occurred, it was common to execute not just the target, but their entire clan. For instance, the incident in the state of Jin saw a power-hungry minister eliminate the powerful Zhao family, killing both adults and children in one sweep. A crime quite shocking. It became the basis of a later legend called the Orphan of Zhao. But from our perspective, massacres like that resemble the work of a mass murderer. Yet in context, it was a political purge, as much as personal cruelty. Similarly, the annals recount how certain rulers paranoid about treason would kill successive advisors. The chronicles of Qi tell of one prince who executed a series of tutors, one after another, for offering advice that he, well, just didn't like. And that's certainly a pattern that hints at an individual who killed repeatedly, almost habitually, to secure their own power, or perhaps out of paranoia, in any case, psychological motivations. But we also see the emergence of professional assassins in this period, men like Zhuanzhu, Yu Rang, and Jing Ke, whose exploits Sima Qian later recorded in his biographies of assassins, which you don't hear about that work very much, mainly hear about records of the Grand Historian, but it is underappreciated. These assassins trained to kill and sometimes notched multiple victims in their careers. For example, Zhuanzhu famously stabbed King Liao of Wu to death during a feast. and another assassin, Yu Rang, attempted multiple times to kill his target, the powerful Chancellor of Zhao, showing relentless, murderous attempt. Although he failed after 2 attempts, but if at first you don't succeed. However, their killings were targeted at specific political figures, essentially as part of missions or revenge, rather than a series of indiscriminate murders. But in the ethos of the time, assassins could paradoxically be seen as heroes if they killed a tyrant. So, while these men were indeed repeat killers, they are not really labeled serial killers in a criminal sense, but indeed they are remembered as loyal avengers or mercenaries with a cause. And for the one at the pointy end of the assassin's blade, I suppose definitions notwithstanding, the result is the same for them. But what about ordinary crime? Just the run-of-the-mill, day-to-day stuff. Well, surely some individuals in the Warring States period must have killed for personal reasons. I don't think we need to put a label of conjectural warning upon that. We can pretty much use our imaginations and make a fairly commonsensical claim. And in fact, legal texts survived, like the legal codes of the state of Jin, or anecdotes in the philosophical work of Han Feizi, and they suggest that banditry and serial theft or murder were certainly common concerns. There are references to poisoners and cutthroat robbers who repeatedly waylaid travelers. Now, for example, the state of Zheng at one point was plagued by a highwayman who killed numerous merchants on the road, a problem so severe that the Lord of Zheng offered rich rewards for the bandits' capture. Though unfortunately, the name of this criminal is lost to history, so I'm afraid we're just going to have to wait for some new discovery. Perhaps we'll know one day who he was. Legalist philosophers like Han Fei classified such a repeat offender as, quote, an abomination, and argued they should be ruthlessly punished. And indeed, Han Feizi recounts anecdotes of serial poisoners in ancient courts and advises rulers on how to deter them. But while few specific names have come down to us, one thing is clear. The concept of multiple homicide by a single person was certainly quite familiar. And the very fact that Zhou laws contain specific provisions for what they called multicide and harsher penalties for killing multiple people shows that serial and spree murderers were occurring and recognized as a distinct evil. But during these turbulent centuries, Chinese thinkers were also philosophizing about the nature of human good and governance, often referencing earlier examples of extreme cruelty to make their points. Confucius, I'm sure you've heard of, who lived from the 6th to the 5th century BCE, lived in the late spring and autumn period, and would have been aware of many bloody events. Though in the Analects of Confucius, which is his main work, he really dwells on the gory side of things. And then, of course, his followers like Mencius, who in Chinese is called Meng Ke, 4th century BCE, explicitly cited the atrocities of King Jie and Zhou as warnings. Mencius argued that the people rightly call such rulers not kings but outlaws, implying that by murdering their own subjects through misrule they forfeited their own legitimacy. In one famous passage, Mencius says King Zhou of Shang, quote, I have merely heard of one man being executed by King Wu. I have not heard of a ruler being murdered, meaning that Zhou's monstrous crimes made him a mere criminal whom the rebel leader had lawfully put to death. This rhetoric shows that, in the Chinese moral view, a killer who kills wantonly and repeatedly, essentially a serial killer with a crown, forfeited their right to be a king. No true king at all would do something like that, surely. Thus, while Spring and Autumn and the Warring States eras don't give us neatly packaged biographies of serial killers like a modern crime novel, they certainly set the stage in two crucial ways. First, they show a society grappling with recurring violence, whether through war or crime, and developing philosophies of law and governance to contain it. But secondly, they preserve the memory of earlier atrocities, like those of Jie and Zhou, as effectively instructive tales. By the end of the Warring States, as the Qin state was poised to unify China, the lesson was clear. Unchecked cruelty by individuals in power leads to chaos and must be prevented by strong law. And quite ironically, as we will see, the Qin unification would bring both harsh law but also new forms of systematic killing, proving that the problem of serial violence was far from solved. So we find ourselves now in 221 BCE. The Qin dynasty, founded by Qin Shi Huang, created the first unified Chinese empire. Now, Qin Shi Huang is often remembered for his ruthlessness, a leader who sought to control not only vast territories, but, well, even thought of itself allegedly burning books and burying scholars alive. Well, under the legalist philosophy, the Qin state imposed draconian laws with severe, often deadly punishments, and this period might be seen as shifting from the personal whims of cruel kings to a more impersonal state-sanctioned brutality. Yet individual actors in Qin also engaged in repeat murder, both in enforcing the law and in political intrigue context. One infamous event was the execution of 460 scholars in 212. As recorded by Sima Qian, the first emperor grew paranoid after he learned that some scholars were criticizing him. So he ordered them all to be rounded up and thrown into a mass grave. While some modern historians debate the details, i.e. it may have been fewer victims or related to an alchemical fraud, the traditional narrative points to the emperor as committing a kind of serial mass murder in one sweep, a punishment so extreme it resonates in Chinese memory as a cautionary tale of tyranny. Similarly, Qin Shi Huang's massive construction projects, like the Great Wall and his own tomb, were carried out with lethal disregard for human life. Thousands of conscripted laborers died from overwork and abuse, and it's said that those who perished were simply buried under the wall, added to the foundations of the very project they gave their life for. Well, the first emperor might not have personally killed with his own hands repeatedly, but his policies caused death on a staggering scale, essentially systematizing murderous governance. And after all, why should those in higher power positions get away with it? When we smear the common man with the term of serial killer, but as soon as somebody is in a position of power, or perhaps in a military context, well, we use gentler language for them. Strange how we do that. In any case, within the Qin court, bloodshed became a tool of political maneuvering, especially after the first emperor's death in 210. His son and heir was deposed and killed through the machinations of the chief eunuch Zhao Gao, who then proceeded to eliminate other princes and high officials one by one. Zhao Gao's actions in 210 to 207 could qualify him as a killer of sorts, though operating via palace plots rather than direct methods. He forged an imperial edict to force the legitimate crown prince to take his own life, executed the great general Meng Tian, sending him poison, and later, dissatisfied with the puppet second emperor he had installed, Zhao Gao assassinated that emperor as well. Well, a pretty chilling chain of events, certainly. Zhao Gao also convened a court meeting and had armed men slaughter all dissenting ministers on the spot, effectively purging the court in a single blood-soaked gathering. He even killed members of the royal family who posed any threat, and for a brief period, Zhao Gao's reign of terror made him the de facto ruler of Qin, until he too was killed by a remnant prince of the family who came back for vengeance. The Qin Empire soon collapsed under rebellion in 206, but not before demonstrating how one powerful individual's murderous ambition could lead to a chain of many killings. Zhao Gao is remembered as a treacherous villain, showing that serial killing in ancient China was often tied intimately to power struggles, rather than the solitary predator archetype that we imagine in our modern contexts. But before we do move on to the Han Dynasty, it's worth mentioning that Qin law itself essentially encouraged a form of serial punishment. The officials expected to enforce collective responsibility, meaning that one criminal's family, and even their neighbors, could be executed en masse. A magistrate who discovered a thief might execute the thief's entire household to deter future crime. Some officials took this task with excessive zeal, gaining reputations for cruelty. For example, the Qin legal code compiler Li Si is said to have approved brutal penalties, like cutting criminals in two at the waist, and applied them liberally. So one might consider such officials as serial killers with a license. Their killings spread across many cases under the guise of law. However, the Qin period is relatively short-lived, and most individual cases of prolonged murder sprees are overshadowed by the epic scale of Qin's warfare and oppression in general. So when the Qin fell, it gave way to a new dynasty that would record in detail one of the clearest cases of a personal serial killer in antiquity, a case that we briefly introduced at the start of our talk today. Liu Pengli of Han. So during the Han Dynasty, 202 BC to 220 CE, a general stable and prosperous era began. One might not expect to find noblemen acting like predatory killers. Yet that is precisely what happened to Liu Pengli, the Han prince, whose story is perhaps the most well-documented instance of serial murder in ancient China. What makes the case so remarkable is that he was part of the Imperial family, the nephew of Emperor Jing of Han, and his gruesome activities are recorded in official histories written not long after his lifetime. So, Liu Pengli was born in the early 2nd century BCE, a grandson of Emperor Wen and nephew to the Emperor Jing. He was, well, enfeoffed as the Prince of Jidong around 144 BC, ruling a small semi-autonomous domain. And by all accounts, Liu Pengli had an arrogant and cruel temperament from a young age. According to Sima Qian, when Pengli was about 29 years old, and firmly in power in his principality, he began to act on his impulses. Night after night, he gathered a band of slaves and some criminal fugitives, forming a personal gang of perhaps 20 to 30 men, and under the cover of darkness, they would ride out to isolated villages and farms, attacking unsuspecting commoners. Sima Qian writes that Liu Pengli and his men went on marauding expeditions, murdering people and seizing their belongings for sheer sport. And that's the thing. These villagers didn't do anything wrong. It was not for political rebellion or anything wartime related. It was just wanton and random violence. Essentially, the prince's own people. He attacked. He should have been protecting them, but they were turned into his prey. Over time, the number of Pengli's victims mounted horrifically. The chronicles state that the confirmed victims exceeded over 100. An entire province was terrorized. People were afraid of leaving their homes at night for fear of the prince and his death squad. And you can certainly imagine the atmosphere of fear. Villagers barring their doors at sunset. Rumors swirling that the insane prince might come galloping by with swords and spears, looking for any easy kills. In essence, Pengli instigated a reign of terror within his country. And for a long time, there was no real recourse. After all, who could punish him? He's a prince, after all, and as the son of the Imperial house, he was above the common law. As for the local officials, they dared not move against the Emperor's own nephew, and the victims' families had nowhere to appeal. The perpetrator was the ruler of the land. But it all had to end someday. What finally brought this horror to an end was an act of courage, and perhaps desperation by one bereaved son. After more than 100 murders, one of Liu Pengli's victims was evidently a man whose son survived or escaped. This young man traveled to the capital to file a complaint to the Emperor himself. A pretty dangerous move, that's for sure, accusing a prince of mass murder. But by that point, the infamy of Pengli's acts had likely reached the Han court's ears anyway, so it wasn't the first time they were hearing of this. Thus, Emperor Jing of Han was forced to confront the scandal. We are told that the high ministers of the court, upon learning of Pengli's atrocities, were outraged and unanimously urged the emperor to have Pengli executed, as any common murderer would be. And indeed, by Han law, banditry and mass murder were capital crimes. No number of victims could be excused, no matter who it was. But there was a problem. Emperor Jing faced a painful dilemma. Executing Liu Pengli meant killing his own flesh and blood, a fellow Liu clan member, and the son of Emperor Jing's late brother. The Chinese Imperial clan had special status, and executing a prince was almost unheard of at the time. In a move that showcased both the privilege of nobility and the determination of the state to assert justice, Emperor Jing chose a compromise. He couldn't bring himself to inflict the death penalty on his nephew, as the records of the Grand Historian notes from Sima Qian, quote, the emperor could not bear to have his own nephew killed, quite bluntly. Well, instead, he stripped Liu Pengli of his title and princely rank, confiscated his fief, and banished him to a remote country called Shangyong, in present-day Hubei province. There Pengli was made a commoner, living under watch far from his former power base, and the punishment effectively removed the threat, as Pengli no longer had slaves or henchmen at his beck and call, and he was isolated among people who surely knew his history. The resolution of the Liu Pengli case is notable. It shows that Han dynasty balanced legal principles with dynastic politics. The court clearly acknowledged that he deserved execution, labeling him in effect a murderous criminal rather than a true prince, yet stopped just shy of killing a member of the imperial family. Nonetheless, banishment was a severe sentence. Liu Pengli lost everything, and records indicate that in 116 BCE, under the emperor's successor, the very princedom he once held was formally abolished and absorbed back into imperial lands. No more would Jidong be ruled by a local king. This incident likely contributed to Emperor Jing's larger policy of centralizing power and curbing the autonomy of regional provinces. In fact, some historians have speculated that the story of Liu Pengli might have had a political angle to it too. You see, the Emperor Jing, who worked to consolidate the empire's unity, could have publicized Pengli's crimes as a justification to eliminate that princely line. It's an intriguing theory. Could it be that Pengli's atrocities were exaggerated, or even partly fabricated by the central government to remove a troublesome feudal lord? Well, it's likely we'll never know the complete truth. We're going back more than 2,000 years after all. Sima Qian, writing around 94 BCE, only a few decades after the events, treats Pengli's guilt as fact. And given the detail and number of the victims, it's hard to believe such a vast crime was invented from thin air. I mean, there had to have been something, a seed out there. But what is clear is that Han Dynasty readers of the Shiji, that is, records of the Grand Historian, would have been horrified by a portrait of a royal serial killer, a man of exalted rank behaving like a murderous brigand, and satisfied by the Emperor's ultimate, if lenient, action to stop him. Well, Liu Pengli's case stands out as perhaps the earliest recorded serial killer case in Chinese history, attested by reliable documentation. Unlike the distant King Jie or King Zhou, Pengli was no myth. He was a known person in a relatively recent and literate era, with his crimes recorded by the most renowned historian of China nonetheless. And for that reason, Pengli often appears in modern discussions as one of the first serial killers in world history. It is chilling to note that his confirmed tally of over 100 victims would place him among the most deadly serial murders known anywhere. And unlike many later serial killers who hid in shadows, Pengli committed his crimes openly and seemingly quite proudly as a ruler, abusing his position to shield himself. And this abuse of power adds a layer of tragedy to the tale. Those meant to be under his protection were the ones he killed. Who do you trust in the end, right? Well, aside from Liu Pengli, there were other serial murders recorded in Han times. The histories do mention other gruesome figures, though not all fit the serial pattern neatly. So we're going to have to use a bit of stretching on the definitions here. One example from the early Han is the Empress Liu Zhi. It is a widow of Emperor Gaozu. While she was not sneaking out to kill random commoners, Empress Liu engaged in repeated killings for revenge and power consolidation. She is infamous for her extreme torture, murder of concubine Qi, a rival consort. Liu Zhi had Qi's young son killed with poison, and then subjected Lady Qi to an atrocity that horrified even the people of that era. First, she had Qi's limbs amputated, eyes gouged out, ears and tongue cut off, and then left her mutilated, blinded, limbless body in a pigsty, calling her human swine. Something tells me that she did not like her very much. Well, this single act of sadism has resounded through history for its cruelty. Empress Liu also executed other political rivals, including several princes of Gaozu by other mothers, in her ruthless bid for power. While her violence was politically motivated, the extreme cruelty displayed, particularly in Qi's case, rivals the worst imaginings of any serial killer. Empress Liu's reputation in history, consequently, is extremely negative, portrayed as a woman of boundless cruelty. It's hard to swing it any other way. But interestingly, historians account that her deeds were used to warn against women in power, suggesting again that these stories served a kind of rhetorical purpose as much as factual record. But nonetheless, the core facts are corroborated by Sima Qian. Emperor Hui, that is Liu's son, was so sickened to see what his mother had done to Qi that he reportedly lost the will to rule thereafter. Liu Zhi's repeated elimination of rivals can be seen as a kind of serial political murder spree, even if not the clandestine killer archetype. But in any case, let's not let her off the hook because of definitions. The latter part of the Han dynasty was marked by growing unrest, as Eastern Han 25 to 220 CE added to that warlordism, peasant rebellions, and just a general feeling of unease, all coalescing together to produce horrific bloodshed. Many warlords carried out massacres. For example, during the suppression of the Yellow Turban Rebellion in 184 CE, generals on both sides slaughtered villagers wholesale. One brutal commander, Zhang Rang, was said to have enjoyed decapitating rebels and piling their heads up in a pyramid as a warning. But again, these are wartime atrocities. Not the work of a lone predatory killer in peacetime, but still, it shows how normalized killing in periods of chaos had become, possibly obscuring any serial killer that might have operated amid the carnage. If things are that chaotic, imagine what someone could get away with. Well, by the end of the Han, China entered the chaotic period known as the Three Kingdoms, from 220 to 280 CE. And here we encounter another infamous figure whose behavior earned him a place in the annals of cruelty. Known as Sun Hao, the last emperor of the kingdom of Eastern Wu. Sun Hao's reign, 264 to 280, is documented in the official histories, that is, the records of the Three Kingdoms by Chen Shou, with commentary by Pei Songzhi, and later recounted by historians as a textbook case of a vicious and violent ruler. The story goes like this. Upon taking power, Sun Hao initially showed promise, but soon revealed a sadistic and paranoid streak. He forced his own aunt, the previous emperor's wife, to take her own life and executed most of his royal cousins out of distrust. Good old-fashioned paranoia certainly helps empty the palace out a little bit. He developed a reputation for torturing officials too who displeased him, earning notoriety even in that violent age. It doesn't stop there, though, I'm afraid. He allegedly kept a dungeon of cruel punishments and enjoyed personally inventing new torments for those accused of treason, or just simply for those who he didn't like, the people who angered him at court, and it did not take much to anger Sun Hao. One story claims he once executed an official by dismemberment, simply because the man protested a new tax. Well, another tale tells that Sun Hao, in fits of a drunken rage, would have servants beaten to death on the spot for his entertainment. They could be colored by later exaggeration, but the records of the Three Kingdoms confirms his murderous paranoia. Over his 15-year reign, the number of people killed at Sun Hao's orders, from ministers to common rebels, certainly reaches into hundreds if not thousands. While these killings were part of tyrannical rule, Sun Hao seems to have derived a perverse satisfaction from them, much like the earlier archetypes. When Eastern Wu was finally conquered by the rival Jin dynasty in 280, the Jin emperor Sima Yan remarked on Sun Hao's brutality and explicitly decided to show a contrast in virtue. You see, rather than executing Sun Hao, the Jin emperor spared him, not wishing to continue the cycle of bloodshed. Sun Hao was taken as a captive to Luoyang and lived out his days in humbled obscurity. The fact that the Jin ruler boasted of not sharing Sun Hao's taste for torture as he pardoned him is quite telling. You see then, by cruelty by then rather, had become a moral measure of legitimacy. Sun Hao's serial killings within his family and court had marked him as a tyrant unworthy of the throne, a judgment very much in line with the traditional mandate of heaven narrative. Sun Hao was far from the only cruel figure of that era, however. The warlord Dong Zhuo, active from 189 to 192 CE, is another who might be called a serial killer in power. Dong Zhuo seized control of the Han capital and reportedly delighted in mass executions. He notoriously plundered Luoyang, killing thousands of civilians, and displayed a callous bloodlust. One account in the Book of Later Han says that Dong Zhuo once invited a number of officials to banquet and had many of them murdered during the feast. Why did he do this? Well, it was simply to instill fear. In The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, a later semi-historical novel, one of the great four classics of Chinese literature, Dong Zhuo is depicted setting entire city districts on fire and laughing as he watches the panic. While the novel is not primary history, it certainly builds on Dong Zhuo's historical reputation for cruelty. And ultimately, he was assassinated by his own adoptive son, Liu Pengli, a violent man himself, though more of a warrior than a sadist. Liu Pengli, it should be noted, committed repeated murders of those who trusted him, first killing the warlord Ding Yuan, and later betraying and killing Dong Zhuo. Liu Peng's pattern, slaying two father figures in pursuit of power, earned him infamy as a treacherous killer, although again these were isolated treasons rather than a continuous spree, so maybe he gets a little bit of a pass into the opposite definition. What we see in later centuries up to 500 CE, though, is a recurring pattern. In times of stability, explicit serial killer cases are rare and shocking, like Liu Pengli under Emperor Jing. But in times of turmoil, many individuals commit serial acts of murder under the cover of war or politics, like Sun Hao, Dong Zhuo, and others, blurring that line between political violence and personal cruelty. But as always, the Chinese historiographical tradition seeks to make sense of these killings in a moral framework. Often the final judgment in the records is that unrestrained cruelty leads to divine retribution or downfall. For example, the historian Chen Shou, in appraising Sun Hao, noted how Sun Hao's atrocities directly led to collapse of the Eastern Wu, and even his own people turned against him. This echoes the refrain from the ancient stories of Jie and Zhou, that serial cruelty is self-defeating in the end, and no one really gets away with it. Indeed, from the half-legendary despots of the Shah and Shang dynasties, all the way to the war-torn centuries of Zhou, the emperors and princes of Han and Three Kingdoms, we've certainly seen some pretty unsavory characters. In the broad sense, yes, there are individuals who murder multiple people over time, serial killers. They were a very real part of ancient China's history and lore, and certainly had the people looking over their shoulders. Whether it was a king torturing subjects to satisfy sadistic whims, a prince hunting humans for sport, or a tyrant executing victims one after another to secure his throne, these stories reveal a dark thread running through the tapestry of China's past. They show us that the fear and fascination with such murderous figures is not an exclusively modern phenomena, but has certainly been with us for a millennia. Now, several key insights certainly come out of our time today. First, the role of power is paramount. Many of the serial killers of ancient China were rulers or nobles who could kill with impunity, and that certainly makes a difference. Their status enabled their deeds. Until it didn't. You lose the status, you lose the enabling. But in each case, eventually the wider society struck back. These stories were preserved precisely because they carried a moral that tyranny unchecked leads to ruin. Well, in a sense, the historians writing about them were likely early criminologists, analyzing how and why these perpetrators arose and how they were stopped. Sima Qian and others implicitly ask, what drives a man like Liu Pengli to slaughter his own people? Is it inherent depravity? The corrupting influence of absolute power? Maybe it's just some kind of undiagnosed mental instability. We're not sure. Secondly, we observe how ancient Chinese law and governance responded to such crimes. The harsh legalist laws of Qin attempted to preempt murder through fear, yet ironically sanctioned mass killings by the state. The Han legal system, more Confucian in ethos, struggled to apply equal justice when the criminal was a prince, showing the tension between rule of law and the privilege of nobility. Emperor Jing's handling of the Liu Pengli case is just one example of that. He ensured the safety of the realm by neutralizing the killer, but stopped short at true justice by not executing him. In any case, the common people had very little recourse to protest that. But another insight, is the mix of history and legend. Some of the most vivid serial killer-like descriptions, like Jie's Lake of Wine and the Pao Lao torture, Empress Liu's human swine, they almost have a folkloric quality in their gruesome detail. Perhaps not something to tell the kids before bed, but folklore is pretty broad, I suppose. Well, yet for all their core, they all stem from references in credible texts. So by favoring those primary sources, Sima Qian and all the rest, we can say that these accounts are perhaps not 100% proven, but they are certainly not mere hearsay. For example, the descriptions of King Zhou's debauchery and torture that's found in Sima Qian and corroborated in the earlier Book of Documents and the Han Fei Zi. The story of Empress Liu's atrocities comes straight from Sima Qian as well, and knowing this gives us confidence that, while we have to take it with a little grain of salt, some of the tone is exaggerated, the ancients themselves wanted these stories to be remembered. They wanted us to know how low human behavior could sink. Well, you've perhaps sunk into a deep sleep by now. Or perhaps you've sunk your attention into learning about our topic for today. Well, in any case, if you're sleeping, I hope you're having a very good dream, one that doesn't involve a gang of men on horses tracking you down. And if you're still listening, why don't you leave me a little comment about what you thought about all of our killers for today. In any case, I'm going to thank my top-tier patrons and supporters, making this all ad-free for you. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfadnir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Taveri, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gokan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, Carrie, Catty B, and Lovely. All right. Thank you so much for joining me today. And if you feel like watching another video, go ahead and do that. Otherwise, I will see you whenever you feel like returning. Good night, everyone. And as always, lots of love to you all. Farewell for now.